Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for part 3 of our Attention Issues, School Stress, and Pain in the Time of COVID series. I'm Georgia Weston, the Executive Director of Creative Healing for Youth in Pain, or as we like to call it, CHIP. We're a nonprofit for youth with chronic pain and their parents, providing exposure to creative healing experiences and social support online to reduce common healthcare barriers like cost and location. We know not everyone has insurance or transportation or equal access to pediatric pain clinics, and that's why we provide these resources online. We also know that healing doesn't have to just take place in a hospital or a doctor's office. You can actually help yourself feel better in your own home. And creative healing means different things to different people, but it's all about finding joy in activities that assist with your healing process. For some people, this means music, art, yoga, walking the dog, whatever makes you feel good, because we know these techniques can actually help reduce an overactive nervous system and increase functioning. Thank you for joining us today. We have a great discussion lined up with your live Q&A questions going on throughout the discussion. We'd like to ask that everyone please keep themselves muted and your cameras off so we can all enjoy without distractions. And you are able to type your questions into the Zoom chat throughout the discussion for Dr. Loo and Dana to address directly. For most people, the Zoom chat you can find at the bottom of your screen. And now I am pleased to introduce CHIP's founder and president, Dr. Lonnie Zeltzer, and board member Dana Pachulski. Dana also serves on the board of the UCLA Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital, is co-chair of the Regenerative Medicine Institute campaign for Cedars-Sinai, the vice chair of Cedars-Sinai's Innovation Center project for the Board of Governors, and is a board member for the Caton Children's Museum. Dr. Lonnie Zeltzer is a distinguished research professor of pediatrics, anesthesiology, psychiatry, and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA. She is the director of the UCLA Pediatric Pain Research Program and co-director of the Whole Child LA Pain Clinic. Dana will be leading our discussion with Dr. Sandra Loo about the state of the science on ADHD and attention issues for teens. Dr. Loo is a professor of psychiatry and director of pediatric neuropsychology and pediatric neuromodulation within the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. Dr. Loo is a clinical and translational researcher whose work over the past 25 years has encompassed genetic, electrophysiology, and neurocognitive biomarkers within ADHD and neurodevelopmental disorders. She has published over 120 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on these related subjects. When I'm done speaking, we're going to switch to multiple speakers on your screen, so your view may change depending on your settings. You can control your view in the upper right corner of your screen by hovering and then clicking on either gallery view or speaker view based on your preference, but we recommend setting it to speaker view so each person who's speaking will become the largest on your screen, which would go back and forth between active speakers. So now I will hand it over to Dana and Dr. Loo and Dr. Zeltzer to lead our discussion. Dr. Zeltzer, do you want to begin?
Right, I'm going to just briefly thank Dana Pachulski, who's a board member of CHIP, who really came up with the idea of these webinars, and they've been great, and she is a superb moderator. And I want to thank Dr. Loo for giving up time in a very busy schedule. If anybody knows Dr. Loo and all of her work, you know, you want something done, you ask a busy person. So I'm going to kind of bug out and leave it to Dr. Loo and Dana. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, Georgia. I really want to start by saying what an honor it is to be working with Dr. Zeltzer, with Georgia, and to have somebody like Dr. Loo with us today, because to be able to talk about the brain and to understand the neurobiology, not just what as parents we see in our kids, but to understand why that's happening, I think is really empowering. So Dr. Loo, thank you for your incredible expertise on both sides, being in the clinic and in research, because we have a lot of questions for you today.
Thank you, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I think we should start with the topic of neuroplasticity, because I think everything else will fall into that. And when we look at pain in the brain and pain in the body and perceived pain, reality, Perceived inability to concentrate is paralleled in the concept of, if I go out today, I'm going to have pain. If I go to school, I won't be able to concentrate. So I'd love you to define neuroplasticity and also weave it in with what we can do to retrain the brain, because that's what we do at CHIP, is help people retrain.
Sure. So neuroplasticity is a normal developmental process. These are long-lasting changes to the brain that happen as a result of development, of experience, of injury. So basically, our brains are constantly changing. There are peak times for neuroplasticity to occur. And those peak times are kind of at birth, so 0 to 3, during your teen years and adolescence, and then we think in the early 20s as well. So the idea here is that there are a couple different things that are happening in the brain. One is that the synapses in the brain, so these are kind of the connections in the brain, are both growing and also there's some pruning and decrease going on. There is, the brain is developing a connectivity sheath that helps it to communicate really, really quickly. So the idea that, the ideas of use it or lose it, or use it and grow it, are really important. So if you think about the brain like a muscle, right? You're either always using it and growing it and making it stronger, and those connections that are involved in feeling better or paying attention or whatever it is are growing and getting stronger. Or if you're not using them, you might be, they're getting weaker and they're not getting built up the way we want them to be. So when we think about neuroplasticity, we really want to think about kind of a couple of different things. And I always think about, in terms of neuroplasticity, I think about it being like building a house, for example. So when you want to build a house, the first thing you need is a strong foundation, right? You have to have kind of your foundation. So that's kind of, not only physical health and all the things that you need to do to get your physical health as healthy as possible. Motivation and effort, arousal and activation, being able to kind of, be conscious and awake and able to take in things from your environment. And then calmness, being able to relieve anxiety and stress so that your brain is free to kind of build the skills. So once you have this foundation, you need to build your house. And your house is built on all of these skills, right? So learning, cognition, behavior, emotion, being able to regulate your emotions, those are all skills that we learn and build throughout our lifetime. And when we do that, our brain also, all the brain connections that we need in order to build those skills and use those skills are facilitated, are used, they get stronger and more connected. And so that's kind of the basic model that doesn't actually, so if we're talking about inattention, for example, you want to, kids with ADHD have a hard time paying attention. And so it's something that doesn't come as naturally to them as other people, for example. And so it's something that they have to practice and build the skill, even though it's really hard. And as humans, we don't like to do things that are really hard. We like to do things that come more naturally to us. But the idea is that with, we can take advantage of neuroplasticity. Thinking about the behaviors that we do today set the foundation for what we can do in the future, right? Because you're almost sculpting, you're strengthening your brain to do the things that you want to do in the future. And so I usually think about, what kinds of goals do you have for your child? What do you want them to know and learn for the future, and then continue to build towards that, using the foundation and then building your house towards the goal. So that's kind of it's not specific to neuroplasticity, but that's more generally how I think about the brain and brain development.
But I think that's really helpful, Dr. Loo, because what you're basically telling all of us at home is use it.
You need to use it. You need to practice it, even if it's hard. I mean, if you think about a muscle that's weak, you need to strengthen it.
And I think for those of us with kids at home that say, you know, I can't concentrate, or have fear of they haven't even figured out whether they've gone to class to see if they can concentrate. They already are saying they can't concentrate. This will help us maybe, and throughout this lecture, get some more tools that we can say to our children. Maybe we can use some baby steps, because one of the things we've been talking about at CHIP is if you get in the same lane, and you stay in that lane all the time, you're using that part of your brain.
That's right. That's right.
And that leads us back to the brain. So in speaking of the brain, what do we see in the brain that's different with kids with ADHD from the actual studies of the brain?
So what's interesting, Dana, and actually, you know, I kind of think about it now across behavior, cognition, emotion, and the brain. They're of course all related, right? They kind of all stem from brain function in a lot of ways, and there isn't one hard difference. There isn't one thing that is always different among kids with ADHD in terms of behavior, in terms of cognition, in terms of emotion, and in terms of the brain. So, you know, we think of ADHD as kind of the extreme of kind of characteristics and traits that we see in the normal population. Much like height and weight, you have a bell-shaped or a normal distribution. And so, and actually we've done studies like that. We actually did a big study in Finland, of all places, 15 years ago, and where we looked at just 10,000 15 to 17-year-olds. And we surveyed attention ADHD-like behaviors in these 10,000 kids. And wouldn't you know it, they come out as a bell-shaped curve. So this is a normally distributed population trait, this kind of inattention, hyperactivity, you know, impulsivity. It's something that we see at the population level. And then the kids that we end up diagnosing with ADHD are on the tail end, so they're on the kind of extreme end of that distribution. And usually it's causing impairment. So they're having difficulty adapting. So it's developmentally not appropriate, and it's causing impairment in school generally, but also at home and in kind of social situations where their peers expect them to be just all the same, right? So in terms of the brain, you know, we know that there are certain neural networks. So a neural network is kind of, you know, connections between the frontal region and other regions in the brain that are important for attention, that are important for emotion regulation. And so, you know, of course, everybody has those neural networks are the same in kids with ADHD. They just might not be as strong, or the connection might not be as strong. And it might be kind of out on, you know, a little on the more extreme end of that. So again, it's, you know, there isn't one brain difference that you can say, this is it, I have an ADHD brain. And that's why we don't have diagnostic, you know, a single diagnostic test for ADHD, because we know that there is kind of variability among your typical group of population of kids and adolescents that are just typically developing. And then you have your kids with ADHD, and the populations are overlapping. So there's no one thing that will define or identify ADHD, but we know that there's kind of a constellation, a profile of differences that put someone at greater risk for showing increased symptoms of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity, and then that creates problems within their environment.
So I have two questions based on that. One, so if it's really relative to brain function and neural networking, going back to your initial comment, use it or lose it, are there exercises or thought processes or something that we could recommend that you would make those connections stronger by developing that muscle?
Yeah.
But really the network being the muscle.
Well, so, so the fundamental difficulty in ADHD is that kids are having a difficult time exerting top-down control over their attention, right? They're not able to to direct their attention to things that maybe they find boring or they're not motivated to learn. And so that becomes, it's the problem, but it's also what may lead to further problems. So I do think that treatments that help a child to focus a little bit more, it's almost like you kind of grease the wheel. You make you help the circuit function, and then if they can practice that, they can keep, if they find it a little easier to pay attention, they're going to it feels good to them. Kids like to be able to pay attention. They know that it's a problem when they can't pay attention, when they're in school and when they're doing projects and homework. They don't like that feeling either. So I do think that there are things that we can do to help kids pay attention. So one thing is, for example, structure, increasing structure in schools and in homes. So, having a quiet, structured place where work is going to happen. Every time they go there, they know this is what I'm to do. And so, I do think, actually, as a digression, I do think that's part of the difficulty with our COVID situation, is that, by having to learn from home, the structure, and we're all kind of on top of each other, trying to do the Zoom calls and trying to do meetings and work. And, I think the structure is less at home because schools are structured to be learning environments, whereas home is where you do everything now. So structure is a really important thing, I think, for kids. And for some kids, that's enough to help them settle down, dial in, and kind of practice working on paying attention for longer periods of time. I think, certainly medication treatments, help with focusing. And it's there at this point, I would say there aren't so many ADHD treatments that actually help increase attention. But that is one of the things that we often recommend. And I will tell you that when I make a diagnosis of ADHD, I think one of the most important things is to learn to treat the problem, to treat ADHD, to treat the inattention. So it doesn't always have to be a medication. I'm certainly open to thinking about different non-medication alternatives to give them a try and to see if that helps. So behavioral, so again, structuring the environment is kind of behavioral, but you can use more explicit behavioral rewards for completing a certain amount of work. And then as it gets longer, they are paying attention longer, for example. We do know that, things like meditation, actually, it's incredibly hard to meditate because you have that we talk all the time about whether that is actually, it's a form of, even though you're clearing your mind, it's a form of paying attention, right? And so again, anything that helps a child practice, anything that helps a child slowly lengthen the amount of time that they can pay attention to something, I think is really good and important and a good strategy. It may not generalize to all the other environments like school or subjects that they may not prefer, but those are the kinds of ideas in terms of improving attention so that neural circuit gets strengthened.
Before we get into the questions I know that everybody wants to hear, what are the alternatives, I want to just take a moment to go back to what you were saying about kids feeling good about when they can think. And so I feel that kids are so concerned that they can't think and they can't learn in this new environment. And I wonder if you could take a moment to help us parents with what we can do, because I feel that a lot of parents, and this is me included, might just jump to, oh, well, we better get you tested. Oh, we better make sure we get you medicine. We need you to concentrate, as opposed to, oh, why, honey? Why are you struggling to concentrate? Because there might be some other things that I'd love to hear from you on.
Well, certainly. So we know that attention or inattention, I say that inattention is something like a fever. So there are so many different factors that can cause inattention, right? So lack of sleep, stress at home, family conflict, poor diet, anxiety, depression. There are lots of things that cause inattention. And so, when you have a fever, you know that something's not right, but you don't know exactly what it is. You know, frankly, you need to do more to find out what the underlying cause of the fever is in order to treat it effectively. So I agree with you. If a child, you know, but children are, you know, children are generally, not 100%, but children are, especially as you get into adolescence, are pretty good reporters about whether they can pay attention. And, you know, unlike, it's like, sometimes I say ADHD is a little bit like having, you know, vision problems, being nearsighted or farsighted, or having a headache. You know, it's something that you can't necessarily see that's happening. You need someone to tell you, that you need the person to tell you this is how I'm experiencing it, or you notice behavioral indicators that something is off. And then, you know, it's sometimes it's not, it's hard. It's, you know, kids can't just say, okay, now I'm going to pay attention. If you have, or if, you know, if you have a headache, sometimes you can't just say, all right, my head's not going to hurt, or you know, I can force my eyes to focus. These are biological issues that should be addressed. And so I think, you know, it's really important to listen to your kids, to hear what they have to say. And they will tell you, they want to pay attention. They realize how important it is. And they want to learn, and they want to do well in their environments. I mean, inherently, I think kids want to do well. And so I think it's important to talk to your child and figure out, not just, okay, so if you're paying attention, you know, what else is happening? You know, tell me what else is going on, and let's try to figure it out, or seek help and ask. I mean, it doesn't have to be, let's assess attention and go for medication. It can be, let's talk to someone and see if we can figure out what else is happening that makes it hard to pay attention.
And I love that, because I think it's letting their children be heard first and foremost. I hear that you're struggling. I hear you can't concentrate. Let's look at a variety of things. And with concentration and the brain and pain and everything else in neuroplasticity, learning something new has proven to be one of the best things we can do to help our brain and for our children to find confidence when they find something they like. So one of the questions that came up is, what's the impact of learning a musical instrument on improving the neuroplasticity for a child with ADHD?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question. And I think, you know, I think that's a really valuable experience sort of thing. If kids, especially if kids gravitate towards it, right? I mean, learning a musical instrument isn't always the easiest thing for a child. I mean, it takes a lot. And so I think if your child gravitates towards music, but there are other things that can help with neuroplasticity, you know? I mean, so a lot of times I recommend, especially if, you know, we want to strengthen kind of the right hemisphere, art, or physical activity like karate. So something where you have to be able to coordinate movement and brain and activity. There are a lot of different things. And I think, so, you know, you want this activity that you're having your child do in order to kind of build neuroplasticity, you want it also to be enjoyable. You want them to want to do it so that the frustration level doesn't kind of swamp the enjoyment level, right?
Absolutely. And I think now that we've learned a little bit about how the brain works and how we can help it work better by making those connections stronger. And, you know, if we have a child with pain that comes to Dr. Zeltzer and to Chip, the first thing we do is get them into new activities that they like, writing, singing, dancing, if they're able to, if pain doesn't limit. But we found that some of the children with pain are able to dance.
Oh, yeah. Well, music. Yeah, no, yes. Actually, even with kids with learning disabilities, that you know, sometimes we kind of design these interventions where it's like, especially if they're very musically oriented, where you can kind of pair music with math, or pair music with, you know what I mean, like beats and rhythm, and it's awesome. It's a great way to do things.
Well, and I think that's really helpful. But a lot of these kids and a lot of families really have looked to both alternative and traditional medicines. And I'd love you to take some time to give us some ideas of what non-traditional medicine, you know, approaches that you would take, and also some medicines and how that looks today.
Sure. So, you know, it's hard. I have parents that come to me a lot asking about non-medication alternatives for ADHD. And, you know, so the kind of more traditional non-medication treatments for ADHD that have some empirical support. So one caveat I'm going to put right out there is I am a data-driven person. So I like to see, if I'm going to recommend any sort of treatment to anybody, I need to see that there is data to support that that's true. And so, you know, in terms of non-medication treatments that have had some empirical support for treatment, actually omega fatty acid supplementation has some moderate support. And then parent and behavioral training and parent training are approaches that seem to help, you know, to have a moderate effect size in ADHD. Things that are not really been shown to work are neurofeedback. In fact, I just spoke at a conference where the kind of state-of-the-art neurofeedback study was just done. And while everybody gets better, the neurofeedback group doesn't actually do any better than what we call kind of non-specific treatment. So the actual training of the brain does not seem to help attention, and it actually doesn't even, they followed the children for 2 years out, and it doesn't actually seem to change much. So that by itself is not going to be so useful. A lot of the kind of cognitive behavioral therapies, which we know are empirically supported for depression and anxiety, don't that kind of classic cognitive therapy also don't help kids with ADHD too much. So I did, you know, my lab, my group, my research group at UCLA has been doing some research on a new and we think really exciting, potentially, treatment alternative for ADHD. And so this is called external trigeminal nerve stimulation. It's a very mild electrical stimulation that's applied by electrodes across the forehead. Children wear this while they sleep at night, and then they take it off in the morning, go to school, do their normal daily activities, and then just wear it at night. So we like for kids to wear it 8 to 9 hours per night. And after 4 weeks of this treatment, the children have significantly more improvement in their core ADHD symptoms than the placebo, the sham control that we used in the study. So, so we actually, my colleague Jim Geffen and I did this study. We published the results about a year ago, actually a year and a half ago, April of 2019. And then, you know, about a week later, it was FDA approved as a treatment for ADHD for kids 7 to 12 years old. So the effect size is a moderate effect size, and it looks like it's about approximately the same as, well, the non-stimulant medications. We did not test it against medication. We're trying to get funding to do that now, but it's about the same effect size as non-stimulant medication, but and not as large as stimulant medication, but it is larger in terms of effect size than kind of all the non-medication alternatives for non-medication treatment alternatives for ADHD so far. And then an extra added bonus is that we seem to find that kids with executive function problems also seem to improve. So what we think happens is that there is this change in the brain, kind of the right frontal region of the brain, that leads to improvements in executive function and subsequently improvements in ADHD symptoms. So again, caveat, that's one study, about 60 kids, and we're trying to get do more research in, you know, larger samples and at an independent research site so that we can see, you know, whether this is actually something that will work for a larger group of children. So, but about 50% of the kids who do TNS show significant improvement in their ADHD symptoms. So we're very excited about that. And then actually just recently, within the last, I would say, month, 2 months, there was actually another, it's not neuromodulation, it's not a device-based treatment, but it's a computerized cognitive training program that has just also gotten FDA approval. So that is actually I actually know the results of that study as well. So they actually showed improvements in sustained attention over the course of, I want to say 3-4 weeks of treatment. And there weren't significant effects on the whole panel of ADHD symptoms, but the kids that had the active treatment did improve in their ability to sustain their attention over a long period of time. And so that is actually what the FDA approval was concerning. So I think that those are promising things that are coming online. That was actually quite a large study. It was 300 kids. And so so the effects weren't quite as wide ranging as you would want something to kind of change, significantly move the ADHD symptom profile, but for kids who specifically have this kind of cognitive difficulty in kind of sustained attention, this seems to be helpful. So I think there are things kind of on the horizon. And then in addition, an additional thing we were trying to do is kind of utilize personalized medicine, or what we call precision medicine approaches. So kind of figuring out who is going to respond to which treatment. So even if you have, kind of a number of non-medication treatment alternatives, but they only work for 50% here or 30% there, if you can figure out which 50% or which 30%, that would be very useful. And so we are trying to push for that kind of research to be done, where you're really, and across actually medication and non-medication treatments, right? Isn't it time that we know going in which treatment would be best for which child, and then have some degree of certainty that it's going to lead to a good response. So we're also trying to move the field forward in that way as well.
Well, before we get into more medicine questions, I'd love to take a moment to talk about the genetic component of this, because what you said is having a roadmap of what might work better, what we might over metabolize or under metabolize, so we don't wait 6 weeks and titrate up and find out that that's a med that's not going to work. Can you talk to us a little bit about what testing is out there right now and the availability of that, where parents would be able to get that type of gene testing so they can profile a little bit better for medicine?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me just say straight up that there isn't a diagnostic, there isn't a genetic test for ADHD. And so, we have long believed that ADHD is a genetic disorder, highly genetic. We know that ADHD runs in families. And so for the last 15 years, my group and I have been looking for genes. We thought there would be maybe a handful of genes of what we call moderate effect size. And we looked and we looked, and the field looked and we looked, and there are a couple things that we learned. We learned that it's not going to be a handful of genes of moderate effect. And we also learned that, we were collecting samples of 1,000 to 2,000, which seemed really big. But really, it takes samples of tens of thousands. In fact, probably samples of hundreds of thousands to find these genes. And so what that means is there's going to be a lot of genes with small effect. And so actually last year, 2019, we published I was an author, it was a huge consortium because we had, I think, 60 or 70,000 total people. The sample was huge. But the first study was published with 10 significant pieces of the genome that put someone at greater risk for ADHD. 10, okay? Now, there are other studies out there that look at other disorders, for example, schizophrenia. And those studies have had, okay, so I believe the ADHD sample was 50K. And the schizophrenia sample was 3 times that, for example. And they identified 100 genes that put someone at risk for schizophrenia. So I'm assuming that as we grow our databases and as we test more people for their genetic just test their genes, that we will have hundreds of genes that put someone at risk for ADHD. So it's going to be really hard, I think, to build a genetic test. And I certainly would not believe any genetic test that would claim that they could tell me that someone is at risk for any disorder, any psychiatric disorder at this point. It's too speculative and likely not right. So, but even the 10 that we just identified in terms of the genes that we identified that put someone at risk, you're right. There are gene pathways that we can now look at and think about treatments that may be more effective than kind of what we're doing now. Again, I have heard that there are people in the community that will say something like, let's do a genetic test to see if your child will respond to the medication. And I would say that's fairly suspect. I don't think that I know that we don't know which genes put someone at greater risk for ADHD, and we don't know which genes put someone at a higher likelihood that they'll benefit from medication either. So hold on, stay tuned. We're working on it, and my hope is that the samples are being built. It's a global effort at this point, and so we are working very hard to continue to collect data and to continue to increase the amount of genetic information that we can identify and then subsequently use to guide either diagnosis or treatment for ADHD.
Well, we'll be excited to hear more about that, finding out what the genetic piece of it is. But I think, so it really leads us back to how the brain is functioning and the neuroplasticity of the brain and training the brain. It sounds like that everything we're using is really just getting activity in the brain to work more. Is that correct?
I think so, yes. I mean, that's what I love about what I do. I think it really does kind of go all the way back to your brain. And so thinking, even with treatments now, I kind of think about, what are the long-term ramifications? Have a long view of, how will that help your child's brain, for example, because that's what we want. What we want for our kids is kind of directly related to their brain and their brain function. So I think that's important.
Would you take a few minutes to talk about, excuse me, about medicine today and what types of medicine you're seeing good results with and why?
So I don't have a very exciting answer to this, unfortunately. Psychostimulants are still the gold standard. And I will tell you, one of the questions I've asked and researched because of my perspective in terms of thinking about long-term brain development is, are medications, ADHD medications, helpful? Do they help brain development? And the data that I've found, there's a substantial amount of data, suggests medications have a very focal effect. It's not like you're just kind of soaking your brain in medication, right? There's a very focal effect in the brain. It helps certain regions that we know are involved in attention get stronger. And so I have looked across all of the data that we can find. Now, there are flaws in the research because, for example, people don't always stay on medication. In fact, the compliance rate of medication is pretty low. So people on average will be on medication for will have their children on medication for about a year, and then they'll stop for a myriad of reasons. And so, but we do know that when people are on medication, basically all of the studies that I've looked at have shown that it helps, not hurt, brain development. So I do think it facilitates the use of these neural circuits and neural networks. And the more you can practice, the more you can engage those neural circuits, the stronger they get. That's what seems to happen. So at the brain level, in terms of brain structure, in terms of brain connectivity, we are seeing actually I haven't seen one study that's shown a negative effect. Every study I've looked at has either shown no significant effect, and that might be because the medication was only for a short period of time, or outside of kind of a critical period, and then, or positive effect. And when I say positive effect, I mean moving brain development more towards kids who are not ADHD.
So one of the questions that came up is, do stimulants alter the brain connectivity or just give bandwidth for ease of retraining the brain?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Yeah. Do stimulants alter the brain connectivity itself, or do they just give you the bandwidth so that you can ease in retraining the brain?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there are studies that have shown that connectivity is improved when when kids are taking medication. I don't know that that's kind of the whole reason that medication helps. It may be both, frankly. It may be that it helps connectivity and it kind of increases the bandwidth. They might go together at the same time. I mean, I just think it facilitates the use of brain circuits that children find hard to use. Children with ADHD find hard to use. And so, there's so much we don't know about the brain. I'm always in awe of the brain. The more we know, the more we don't know. But I do think that, so I think it could be both is my answer to that. But we know that it has effects kind of all the way from the structural level to the structural, so changing actually the white matter and the gray matter of the brain, to making it denser and thicker, the cortical thicknesses thicker. And then we know on a functional level, there's more activation in some regions. There is greater connectivity. So I think it's kind of I guess that's bandwidth. I don't know, but it's broad. The effect is broad in very focal areas.
So it sounds like it's connecting parts of the brain that weren't activated. So I say this all the time, and we talk about this at CHIP all the time, that if you have a thought pattern, I can't think, it's like being stuck on a lane of the freeway, and you get stuck in the sticky neural loop. And how do we get the brain to release that thought pattern and that process? We have to give you a different stimulation. It's right. Music, it's dance, it's cooking, it's anything new than what you're used to doing in this kind of routine manner because you've limited into your lane. And as we give you new stimulation, your brain connects to different parts of the brain, which sounds like you're getting these bonus parts of gray matter and density by making the connection, which in essence gives you the off-ramp from that freeway that you're stuck on, the highway of the brain.
Yeah, and I would say, by introducing these different activities, you introduce success and enjoyment in learning as opposed to frustration and this kind of negative lane that you're in. So I think there are lots of different, and then probably increased health as well, especially if we're talking about, I think the experience of joy by itself can make your health better. So I think they're all really important.
So something to think about would be during COVID to not be as uber routine as we once were, or to try a new routine to access different parts of our brain.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a balance, right? So I think structure is good, but adhering to old routines that aren't very effective, aren't helping a child grow and learn, are not so good. Yeah.
So structure with some new to keep the brain stimulated.
Right. Or at least structuring, or even just structuring in time for enjoyment and for play and for music and things and physical activity, so that kids can move their bodies and then also settle down and maybe have short periods of learning. I think all of that is really good.
Okay, well, I'm getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to give you some out of context now, if you don't mind, because I want to make sure I get everybody's questions in. One is any long-term negative effects of meds and any stunted physical growth, nervous system issues that you could talk about.
Yes, excellent question. So I think it's like the 13-year outcomes of what was kind of the landmark treatment study in ADHD. This is called the multimodal treatment of ADHD study, MTA. Those results were recently published. So in terms of long-term growth, they did find a difference, and it was significant because the sample was quite large, In the end, it ended up being about an inch in height. And I can't remember exactly the weight, but it was about, so it was significant. There are impacts on growth. And so I've heard both arguments, right? So it was an inch. And if some people would argue that an inch is not as important as actually being able to pay attention and succeed. But there are documented growth effects with medication. Actually I have to assume that, I mean, this was an expert group of researchers that they also tried to kind of change, for example, have the child eat breakfast before having their medication. They maybe have tried different medications, but there are ways that we try to mitigate the long-term growth effects of medication. But again, I'm going to just benefit of the doubt. This is landmark study. They tried those sorts of things, and there was still a long-term effect. In terms of a long-term functional effect, the literature's been very mixed. And again, part of this is due to the fact that children tend not to stay on medication, and we don't have studies that last for 15 years, 10 years, 5 years that require people to stay on medication, right? So we actually, it's difficult to measure the long-term effect because people are generally not on medication for the long term. So that said, there are some, I mean, I would say the vast majority of the literature suggests that there is no kind of documentable long-term effect on occupation, on that's, again, that you can single out as being due just to medication as opposed to parental support and all the other kinds of things that get put in place. So I think, it's one of those things where we need to study it more, and maybe there are ways. I actually would say that in terms of ADHD remission, so kind of no longer meeting diagnostic criteria. So, kids with ADHD, if you have 100% of kids with ADHD, about 2/3 of those kids going into adolescence will continue to meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD. And then from adolescence to adulthood, another 2/3 will continue to meet diagnostic criteria. So you have a third and then a third. And so I do see that the rates of diagnostic remission, so not meeting criteria for ADHD anymore, those kids tend to not meet ADHD criteria at a higher rate. So diagnostic remission is higher among medication-treated samples. But there's always a range. And again, we're not really well able to control who stays on medication and who doesn't. So I think that science is kind of up in the air. And I don't know that we'll ever be able to do those studies. But I think those are important questions. I think, I tell parents all the time, you have to kind of, parents are the experts on their kids. And I think you are continually assessing whether the treatments that you have in place are useful for your child. Is it helping them to do the kinds of behaviors that we're hoping that they will grow to do on their own eventually, And I think you have to kind of constantly assess that. And it's fine, especially if you're on kind of short-acting stimulants, do drug holidays as often as you can. It's fine. Do it every weekend. As long as, and then watch their behavior. I think that's I think that's how I would approach it if it were my child. And I think the same is true for any treatment, non-medication treatment that you use for your child as well. It has to address the symptoms of whatever you're using that treatment for.
And give them confidence that something's working for them. I have a great question that goes back to video games and social media and how that trains the brain or potentially trains the brain for immediate gratification. And with a kid that's not diagnosed with ADD but shows signs of trouble focusing, how does that play into that, from that immediate gratification and getting a lot of social media and game time in right now?
Yeah. So I would say that, the way ADHD is kind of being conceptualized right now is less about, can you pay attention to something that is a computer game that's very, very stimulating for you. For example, I've had plenty of parents where I've made the diagnosis and they say, but he can sit and read for hours. How can he be ADHD? Or he can play a computer game for hours. How can that be ADHD? And so the idea here is that ADHD is a regulatory disorder. It's not just, can you do it every once in a while or in certain situations? It's, how do you regulate your attention? How do you regulate your emotions? How do you regulate your behavior? And so I think, I think all of those things, both computer games and social media are things that come up all the time, right, with kids and adolescents. I think everything in moderation type of approach is okay. So, things are not going to go well if your child loves to play computer games and never gets to play them, and social relationships. I mean, there are pluses and minuses to social media, right? And so I think kind of monitoring and moderation, I think, are important things to think about for both of those areas. And then kind of, again, thinking about in terms of regulation, how do we want to teach kids to regulate, their brains and their bodies and their behavior. And so I don't know if that directly answers the question, but that's how I approach it, and that's how I think about it and advise parents.
Great. And going back to the stimulation that you put on the front of the forehead, what was the name of that again?
TNS.
TNS. And where would somebody go to learn that they're a candidate for that and be able to get it, and any costs associated with that, so we could give a little more information regarding that option?
Sure. So TNS is commercially available and by prescription. So you need a doctor's prescription to obtain the device. I believe you contact the company that manufactures it directly, and then you need to provide they have a form maybe that the doctor does a prescription on. It's expensive, and it's the stimulator is about $1,000, and then the electrodes are replaced every day. And so I believe the cost for the supplies run around $300 a month. I think that's right. So it's not cheap, and because it's new and because it's recently approved by the FDA, insurance companies, my understanding, what I've heard, is that insurance companies are not paying for it and they're not reimbursing for it. So I think that makes it important. I mean, this work that we're doing to try and predict in advance who will respond. So our work suggests that there is a parent rating scale called the BRIEF, and it's just the behavioral ratings of individual executive functions. So on this BRIEF scale, certain scores, kind of a T-score of 70, like an impairment in certain areas, suggest that a child are predictive, significantly, moderately predictive, of a child responding well to TNS. Now, again, this is kind of brand new science, and I don't, I've been trying to give talks and disseminate that information. I think at UCLA, I've given several talks at UCLA, so people are becoming more aware, the docs at UCLA are becoming more aware. And then in this time of COVID, I've had to cancel a lot of the talks that I've been giving, but I think it's like anything. I mean, science is a slow-moving beast, and I think it's slowly going out into the community.
That's one more option that we'll hope to see come to the forefront and become more affordable through insurance. Back to the medicine, and in the last couple minutes here, to have effects continue for the meds, should kids continue their stimulants on weekends and the holidays? You touched on it, but I'd love to take another moment to maybe bring it into COVID times. What's different about taking medicine at home versus an all-day effect? And also, what do you see as the best for continued effect?
So again, it depends on which medication we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about kind of the short-acting stimulants, or even the long-acting stimulants, really. I mean, they're, you know, in general, my experience has been that the short-acting stimulants seem to work a bit better than the kind of extended formats. And so again, I'm a psychologist, I'm a neuropsychologist. I think about brain and I think about cognitive functioning. So for me, I really do think these short-acting stimulants are kind of like glasses, you know, put it on when you need it. And you know, in situations where you need it. So in learning situations, I think you need it, right? In times of rest and relaxation, probably don't need it that much, right? I don't think that there is. So I think, and as long as, and you know, if that's actually something that helps people sustain it over the longer term, so longer than a year, you know, this kind of on and off format, I think that that is a win, if you ask me. So I think, you know, I'm very pragmatic when it comes to, you know, it's like you're using it to achieve an effect. This is not, and if I'm being honest, I mean, there are some parents who would rather have their child medicated because it's difficult. I mean, having a child with ADHD, I'm sure is really difficult. So having a child, period, can be challenging, right? So anyway, I think, but you know, I think kind of just a pragmatic approach. Again, I think about the long-term brain development. And so, you know, what are you trying to achieve? And, you know, if it's in a time where they're just relaxing, where it doesn't really matter as much if they're, you know, paying attention, but even in sports, even in music, even in arts, I think there are, you know, those experiences are enhanced when you're being able to pay attention and to focus on what you're doing. So again, a balance, right? But I do think that having an ability to come off, a lot of kids don't like the way the medications make them feel, and I completely understand that. Some kids feel like the medication makes them less creative and less able to kind of, you know, generate creative thought. So if that's a situation, then, you know, you have to personalize it. You have to talk to your child and understand how they're feeling and what it makes them feel, and then kind of use some judgment, use some balance in terms of thinking about it.
This has been really informative, and I really appreciate you covering such a broad group of topics for us. And
Sure.
in summation, use your brain, right? Use it and find new ways to use it.
Think about your brain over the long term. Yes.
Well, thank you. And Georgia, back to you. And thank you everybody for joining us today and sending in your questions. It's really helpful because I love to incorporate them as we are talking about those as opposed to at the end. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for your time and everybody's time today. Back to you, Georgia.
Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Loo, Dana, Dr. Zeltzer, for this informative presentation. And thank you, everybody, for joining today. This will conclude our series on attention issues, school stress, and pain in the time of COVID. Please feel free to always reach out with any questions. You can follow CHIP on social media to learn about future events. You can check out our website, mychip.org. And next week, we will be sending the recordings of this discussion and the previous two discussions out to you all through your email. So keep an eye out for that. We wish you and your families health and wellness during these challenging times. And thank you so much again, Dr. Loo and Dana, for taking the time to talk with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.